All right, so we're going to mix things up a little bit here for this panel. I'm going to do a brief introduction of everybody, but then I'm going to give each of them a challenge and then give each of you a challenge as well, or many of you as possible, is that for each of the speakers here on the stage, I'm going to ask them as we're going along. It's kind of like you go to a party or you're out at a bar, you're hanging out, and the conversation just naturally evolves. And when people share something, you think, well, let me ask this particular question. So I'm asking each of the other panelists to ask each of the other panelists at least one question, right? So a couple questions from each person. And for all of you, feel free, please, at any time, we've got the mics going around. At any point in time, feel free to jump in. And everybody online, I am looking this entire time at my phone. I am not just texting my friends and family. Right? I am looking at Slack to see if there are any specific questions that everybody, the many people online, you guys are thinking about potentially asking that you would like to have covered here in the Questions for Speakers channel. So really quick though, let's go ahead and do a quick introductions here. I'm gonna just mention very briefly, we've got Kevin Tyers. Now Kevin is also a SANS instructor here, but in his day job, in his regular life, he leads a team of cloud security architects and engineers at GitHub, right? A lot of fans of GitHub here. He's had various previous leadership and engineering roles at PayPal, Dignity Health, Level 3 Communications, and so on. And then right next to Kevin here, further to my right is Casey Essary, who is the Deputy CISO at Bill. Now, Casey also has had different security leadership roles at other places like Twitter, E-Trade, United Health, and so on. So long career here in security overall. We'll talk a little bit about where that started at some point in time. And then, of course, you know Eric on the far end, but we didn't necessarily share our background. Eric is not only a longtime SANS instructor, he is the founder of a company called Puma Security, in case anybody has ever used that tool. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in here. And since I just finished with Eric, right now, I'll ask you all a question to think about. And the question is, we all know about the cloud provider shared responsibility model, right? This is a cloud-focused event. But the question is, well, when does shared responsibility really become just customer responsibility, right? And to start with a specific example of this is Eric, as he was writing, updating, him and Brandon Evans were creating and doing some research for the latest version of the SEC 510 Cloud Security Controls and Mitigations course. They were doing a bunch of research and testing out different cloud provider offerings. And well, they found something serious for which they got a bug bounty. Eric, can you tell us a little bit about that bug bounty?
Yeah, so it's all released, it's all public now, and there's a couple of blogs out there. I know Brandon published a blog on LinkedIn. There's also an equivalent blog out on the SANS website. But the short story is Defender for Cloud has some cloud security posture management capabilities inside of it now. And using that CSPM tool, you can connect your AWS accounts and organization or your Google Cloud org and your Google Cloud projects to Defender and pull all of these misconfigurations that would fall generally onto the customer side of the responsibility model into a dashboard. In AWS, with the way that IAM roles work, and we heard yesterday a couple of times about trust policies in an IAM role, where you can choose which external principals or internal, an IAM user or some federated credential that's been issued through an OpenID Connect identity provider or a SAML assertion from some external IDP can assume an IAM role. And in this whole role assumption process, there's an issue, if you go look for it with AWS IAM roles, called the confused deputy. Now, the confused deputy occurs when you know the ARN, the unique resource name for an IAM role. And what happened with Defender is that as part of the setup process, it would say, we need you to create a role in your AWS organization. So Defender can assume that role and read all of the resource configurations. With confused deputy, the issue there is if I name my role like Defender, for example, something very not creative, and all of you find out and or guess my 12-digit AWS account ID, if you went into your Defender dashboard and you put in what is Eric's AWS account number, what is the name of the role, Defender, you could actually connect to my AWS organization and pull all of my configuration mistakes into your Defender dashboard. And that's what the confused deputy role is. And it's not Defender specific. There's a lot of other kind of third-party vendor access scenarios in the cloud where this is possible. So that was the issue that we reported to Microsoft, and it of course went through their Microsoft researcher process, and they validated the issue. And there was a small window where it was a problem. They had largely fixed most of it by the time we saw it, but what they had not fixed was that for customers that had previously gone through the setup process, that had already created the role that was missing this external ID or unique value check to prevent confused deputy, they didn't retroactively tell them that you needed to go update your trust policy in your role. And that was ultimately what they fixed. The solution to it was pretty interesting, and it relied on the fact that Defender, because of the permissions to do CSPM scanning, had read access to the trust policy, to the own role that they were assuming. So the way that they fixed it just across the board is they read that trust policy as it was about to assume the role, and it looked and it said, is there a check for this unique tenant ID, which would be your Defender tenant? And if that was missing, then they shut it down and said, you need to go update your role. This is vulnerable to this problem. And so I thought it was a really unique fix and something that was pretty clever on how quickly they rolled that out across their environment to kind of squash that thing. So it was a pretty good, exciting process to go through overall, fairly complicated, and I'll pass it back to you all.
Now I want to circle back to Eric about that here in just a moment, but I'm going to go to Casey. And I've seen situations and heard from other friends and colleagues when they find an issue or a vulnerability in something from a cloud service provider. Sometimes the cloud service provider says, well, hey, that's not on us. That's a misconfiguration. The customer actually has to deal with that particular thing, going back to that shared responsibility model. And Casey, you've led a lot of, you currently lead a wide array of different functions and have led different ones in the past, currently like security engineering, operations, product security, and so on. And when something like this comes up at work, what's the process that you and your teams typically follow in terms of communicating with the cloud service provider or another vendor?
Yeah, so first I'll say I think it's important to have and to maybe not wait on a circumstance like that to get contacts with them that you can call on, you can have conversations with, you can share your goals, you can share what you're doing as a company, and I think that that's critical to already have those relationships and already have those conversations started. But then in a circumstance where you certainly have something that can feel like that in between, it's feature or flaw, like we like to say sometimes, but it sits in that in between. Like I said, I think it's a conversation. I think you have to have the right skill sets on your own team to be able to have those conversations and push back where it's necessary. I think it's important to hear from their perspective, why those configurations are the way they are. Talk about workarounds, talk about capabilities that you can create on your side, but then give them that feedback. Again, I think it's that communication about what these challenges are. The space is vast. There's always mistakes that can be made. There's always holes. There's always vulnerabilities. If there weren't, we wouldn't have a job, and I wouldn't be sitting here. I think it's critical to have those conversations again about what that is. Be proactive with those conversations, but also. I think that once you get everyone's heads together and have that creative conversation about how they can be solved, similar to what you were discussing, I think new things can be built from it. But I think, again, not to oversimplify it, but I think it comes back to those conversations with those providers and talking on a proactive basis about where those security risks are for your organization and how it can be applied.
Kevin, what about you? Any tips from a vulnerability assessment and engineering perspective?
Yeah, I think that if you look historically at something like S3, right, back in the day when you would provision an S3 bucket, it was wide open, right? It was exposed out to the internet. And that's because the people developing out these cloud platforms, right, it's about enabling developers and creating cool stuff. And security is not usually the first thing that they're thinking about, right? When a cloud provider has to decide between selling a feature and making it secure, they're probably going to sell the feature, right? So I think this comes down a lot, in my opinion, to training your developers to know how to use these things safely, Because most of the time when I've encountered these things, when I do, side little consulting for my friends who have little startups, they're the ones who kind of messed up, right? They're like, oh, there's too many foot guns here, right? They don't know what's going on. And then I'll mention again something Casey brought up about building your network, right? When I used to work at level 3, a lot of the ways that our customers would get support is we would all go to conferences and get to know each other, and then we had each other's email addresses, right? It wasn't going through the help desk. It was, reaching out to your homies via email. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Eric, going back to you, you described eventually it wound up getting fixed under the hood for those existing type of roles.
Yep.
At any one point in time, was there a, hey, no, this is on you. This is we don't need to do anything. And how did that negotiation go? Because if we think back to the Capital One breach, right, from some time ago,
Yep.
a key element of that was, well, hey, AWS wound up taking some heat for arguably what was, the responsibility of the customer in that particular case. That was a little bit more political, right, in terms of why some of that outcry might have happened. But yeah, Eric, what happened in this particular case?
For the bounty that they accepted, there was a lot of just, we recognize that this is a problem with the platform, and for various reasons. I mean, AWS is complicated, and you're asking folks inside of Azure to understand another cloud provider that usually they won't say the name of the other provider out loud and acknowledge their existence. So it's understandable that we didn't maybe understand quite how role assumption worked. Before that, if you look at the history, I actually, related to the same feature, submitted this one got categorized not as a critical, but as a medium. And it was related to the permissions that they attached to that AWS role. And this also is the same in Google, but there's various managed roles where, like, read-only is horribly named because you think read-only, but it's management and data plane access. And I watched what Defender was doing in Google and AWS just via the audit logs, and I reported, you're asking for way too many permissions here. And we heard yesterday that 90% of cloud principals use about 5% of the permissions that they're granted. And in this case, that was pretty accurate for the Defender role. And in that moment, Frank, they did just squash it, and they just said, no, that's your job to not follow our instructions and minimize the permissions on your own. And that one was just kind of swept under the rug. And eventually, quietly, they did roll out a least privileged option on that page, which is a much more fine-grained set of permissions. So they still addressed it, but also kind of said, yeah, it's maybe not our problem, which is kind of interesting.
Gotcha. So next one to Casey here, which is related. Eric was just talking about roles and access and principles, and the Capital One breach that I mentioned, as many of you probably know, is underlying. It was kind of a abuse of the instance metadata service that then AWS rolled out an updated version of it with some additional protections. Now, Casey, this is related to a question here we have in Slack, and yesterday, identity was a big topic. And the question is, hey, what trends and solution gaps do you see in the identity security solutions space today?
Okay. I'll try to hone in. So this is I think identity and access management is a soft spot for me. But as Frank said, I started before cloud in that whole space. And I've watched kind of just identity across. It doesn't matter if you're talking about the specific identity within the platform itself or the tools you use to manage those identities or access management. But what I think the challenge is today is many of us exist in a hybrid environment of on-prem, cloud, managing all of those identities together, having tools that need to manage all of those identities together, and some tools that you go out to market to go get today to help you manage your identities, or again, the management of those identities. They're great in the cloud or they're great on-prem, but they're not great at both, actually. And I think that this space is evolving. I think every single day, I mean, I'm literally talking with vendors in this space just to keep current on everything that's going on in the new space almost every week. Yes, we have some work going on that we're maturing our space at Build to do this, but I think you have to. I think that you have to stay in front of this. There are, again, vendors, tools out there that can do some really amazing things, but they'll be the first to tell you, yes, we operate very much and in the cloud, which is great for what we're all talking about here. But if you've got a hybrid environment, or if you're on the journey of making that migration to the cloud, you've got to make sure that whatever tools you have today could service identities and that access management in the cloud, or you've got to find those tools that can do that. And I would just caution, when you think about that, when you look at these vendors, there's so many now, and I feel like every day there's a new one coming on. The capabilities that some of those SaaS providers, those identity and access management providers in the cloud need, sometimes the security of of the role permissions and the things that they need to be able to service those identities or those access management capabilities can actually add risk to your organization. And I don't mean to poke at any vendors. I'm just saying that with the way that that's created, that can be a real thing. So yeah, those are it's a big space, and it's evolving is the generic answer to that, but it's very current.
Great. And then going to Kevin with a slightly different spin here. For everybody, just a quick reminder though, everybody online and in person, feel free, chime in with any questions here in person. Just raise your hand if anything comes up. Reminder for everybody on the panel, remember, what's the questions you want to ask your fellow panelists here when the time is appropriate? Now, a little bit of background here about everybody that's currently on stage is actually all of us happen to have some sort of development background back in the day. Some of us still write a little bit more code than others. And but the reason I mentioned that related to identity is I recall in my early days writing a bunch of code, Java code that unknowingly had a bunch of vulnerabilities. But part of it, which is how I got into security on a full-time basis, but writing a bunch of code that had to integrate with single sign-on libraries, writing some SAML and figuring out all of that ugly XML and so on. So Kevin, what is the journey in terms of kind of from a development perspective, getting into security, and how have you seen it connecting the dots by looking back?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I started out early in my career in the mid 2000s, when I still had frosted tips and was like 100 pounds lighter, it's pretty cool. I worked at Global Crossing, which, if anyone remembers, that was the largest bankruptcy in history for a while, which was pretty cool.
Which was a contribution to that.
Yeah,
nice job.
That's what I did. I came after that, to be fair. And they got bought by Level 3, which many of you probably know because they're based out of Broomfield here, which then got bought by CenturyLink. Anyway, so I got promoted into the customer architecture team where I was developing out network architectures, and it was really cool and super exciting because I unironically love BGP, right? So I had a customer, had 400 routers, and the config was pretty much the same thing over and over again, except for 2 values. The values were predictable, and I had a spreadsheet of what they were going to be. And I was like, I don't want to ruin my weekend, writing these by hand because Wrath of the Lich King just came out, right? So I was trying to play some WoW. So I go to our tools developer, his name was Bobby, super great guy. And I was like, hey, Bobby, how would you do this? He's like, well, I would just write a script to do it. And I was like, well, I'm not talking about movies. That was a better thank you. That took a second for y'all to come through. So I was like, okay, what do you mean? He's like, well, go learn Perl. And then Skylar, my mentor at the time, his head popped up over the wall. And he's like, do not learn Perl. It is 2010, learn Python. So I did, right? I went out and I learned Python, and I absolutely fell in love with it. The ability to create things, create scalable, software that did really neat stuff was amazing. Personal productivity stuff, enterprise-wide scripts that were running BGP configs and ACLs. So I, sort of took my networking experience, learned how to code, deeply fell in love with that, and then Global Crossing at the time was starting a managed security product, and they needed help, and I was like, hey, I like firewalls, I like coding, let's hang out. And I really focused for a long time when I had a lot more energy in my 20s of reading RFCs and coding all the time and doing all these really enriching things technology-wise. So let me get to the end point here. So I go work for PayPal for a long time. I helped stand up their original SOAR team, which was really exciting. I then moved on to our threat intelligence team and built a ton of threat intelligence tools while also doing research. And it was during this time where I really appreciated the power of computer science in becoming a better security person. I know that it's a little bit of a controversial topic to say that, you should know how to code if you're in security. You don't have to be a top tier, ultra rust dev who can do, pointer math in their sleep, right? But I do think it is important to understand for loops, variables, mutation. I might even say that you should understand some object-oriented principles, right? In the way that I sort of boil that down when I'm trying to explain this to people is, it's like being a physicist without understanding math is kind of how I think about it. If you don't know any coding, right? You can take measurements, you can probably even make some pretty good predictions about how things will operate, but until you have that slightly lower level understanding that mathematics, or for us, that computer science, you know, there's a level of intuition that I think is blocked without having that info. So go read Think Python if you're curious. That's a great free book. It's how I learned. It's like a high school textbook. It's a strong recommendation for me.
Casey, yeah, I want to go to you next here in terms of kind of, you've got a wide remit at Bill, which is, to be honest, a little bit unusual for a deputy CISO to basically be running the whole or the large swaths of the security program. You know, Kevin just shared his journey, kind of, hey, where did it start for you and how did it end up where you're with what you're doing now?
First of all, I was a developer, but it was a long time ago. I haven't touched a piece of code, and my team is thankful for this. I haven't touched a piece of code in a really long time. But I did start out as a Java developer. That was what I thought I was going to do forever and ever and ever and ever. I loved having my hands on something, and I loved developing something and kind of seeing the fruits of the labor. But then Sarbanes-Oxley came along and said, no, we want to take this really great intelligence that you have as a developer of however many few years I was doing it, and we want to make you an auditor. And so, you know, with that, what I immediately realized as I became an auditor is that in the development of what we were doing at the company I was at, we didn't have a single security person like really managing and watching what we were doing with our code. You know, that I have some think backs to the code I wrote and the and the things that we did in the JavaScript we wrote, and realizing that we could have been far more secure and capable with that. So I carried that with me. I was an auditor for a while, and immediately kind of transitioned into security. I think that's a natural for some to take this concept of um, this do good mentality, this defend this mentality, and try to make what we do better and more secure for our customers. And so I have a long journey of risk management. I have a long journey of kind of looking at it from that angle, kind of what are the risks to the business, what are the risks to our platforms and our applications, and where that comes from. And spent a long time in governance, risk, and compliance after that. But then, as Frank said, it's kind of slowly like kind of covering the breadth of what we do in security. And I feel like it's an orchestration. When even the concept of cloud, like we have these concepts of like a single person on my team a long time ago. It used to be the cloud person, right? Like the cloud security engineer. And now it's baked into literally every role that we have across Bill. We all have to have that capability. And so kind of going back to application security, and that development capability, my journey started from that very specific point, but it grew to kind of be more broad across security and kind of figuring out how all of that works. It doesn't matter if you're that person that's trying to defend the application or person that's looking broadly across that. It's an orchestration of making sure that security isn't in just one place. It's across the platform, it's across the product, and how all that works together. And that's how I got from point A to point B, is loving how all of that fits together from starting there.
Great. Yeah. Before you mentioned a key word there is risk, which I want to circle back to here momentarily. But first, go to Eric to see, before I ask you the next question, is there anything else you want to chime in on this one?
No, I think it's a similar story. Everything for me was building apps to, okay, I found a flaw in one.
Yes.
That's interesting. Having that curiosity. And as our team we had 30, 40 different apps we're building. And when I found it once, I'm like, I wonder if that's in the other one. Oh, shoot. Yep, it's over there. And then it becomes, well, how do I do this faster? And how do I automate this? And
Yes.
that motivation just bleeds into everything else. It's in the cloud. How do I scan all of my S3 buckets for the same misconfiguration? And you kind of started learning how APIs work. You cannot work in the cloud space without understanding APIs. And if you're going to invoke an API, like how do I use Postman? I got to put an authorization header in here. And before you know it, just incrementally, you're knee deep in programming concepts, whether you wanted to be there or not. And I don't think I walked out of college thinking that someday I'm going to understand all 300 cloud provider APIs across, AWS, Azure, and Google. But you know what? Here I am, and I'm still knee deep in it. And I probably won't ever get out until I just hang it up. So that's the direction everything's going.
Absolutely.
I'm going to jump around here to the various questions. We got a few that came in here online. It's started with addressing Kevin, well, and the other panelists. But hey, Kevin, what are your thoughts on incident response in the cloud and the capabilities that do and don't exist that you wish were better?
Yeah, incident response in the cloud it's a tough topic. I think I'm going to talk about training yet again. I think about the SOCs that I've worked on and worked with, and amazing incident responders who are Windows, wizards, and Linux, also wizards. I'm trying to think of a L word, it didn't work. And they can get on there and pull evidence and whatnot, and it totally works. But then when it comes to the cloud, I think that a lot of SOC people or incident responders don't necessarily have the right mental models to understand something like AWS Lambda function, right? Because they'll be like, "Where's the logs?" I'm like, "Oh, I'll just log into the server." Be like, "Well, there is no server." "Well, we'll just grab the container logs." Be like, "Well, there's no container either, right? It's just code that runs." And so I think the big thing is being able to get those logs, right? Because ideally you're not looking at them in the console, right? I think there's a lot of opportunity in pulling logs and centralizing them. I think that it's great that logging is built into a lot of this infrastructure already. If anyone ever used ArcSight a million years ago, I remember installing Logger on domain controllers, and you're like, "What is happening?" So how did I
Oh,
end
you
up
had to
here?
go through that.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. I cut my teeth. So yeah, I think to sort of summarize the question, I think that the greatest capabilities and opportunities are proactive detection and being able to bring things in, as well as proactive response, right? As Eric mentioned, everything's an API. So if you want to push something, you want to shun an IP, you want to rotate a password, whatever, you can write some light scripting to do that, or use an existing SOAR platform. And I think the challenge is really just getting the investigators to understand, what are the implications of something being hosted in S3? And then how does Athena hook up to that, right? Which is something we saw at a previous company I worked for, and someone was abusing that. And people didn't quite understand, like, well, where's the database? Well, the database is S3. They're like, no, but S3 is not a database. I'm like, I know. I'm so sorry. Right? So excellent question. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to jump around to different questions here, if that's okay with you guys. Feel free to chime in at any point in time if you want to add on to any other of these other topics. But Casey, going back to that risk question, Jerry says, given the complicated nature of the cloud IAM space, what are the most salient points to share with non-technical leadership to help them understand the nature of the risk?
Yes. Wow, we could talk about that for a while. So I would think for non-technical people that are kind of understanding this space, and I know the question was around identity and access management, but I'll just kind of broaden that to just say the risks that are present in the cloud are the same yet different than the risks that you would have for an on-prem environment. Your conceptual risks are the same. You think about access management, you think about overprivileged access, you think about again vulnerabilities, you think about all of these things. They're present in both, and they can be present in both. But the way you detect them, the way you see them, the way you instruct your teams and have skill sets to be able to see them, and how you just mentioned the SOC, near and dear to my SOC's heart, what you were saying there. Bringing all of that data together to understand that data, to normalize that data across your space. Again, many of us, I assume, are in a very hybrid situation where we can't ignore the current risks and the risk register and all the things that we were talking about on our on-prem environment. And now we've just created a whole new layer with a cloud that's physically there. And so I think for non-technical leadership that's in this space, I think on the surface, the cloud looks like this very fast, very capable, we can deploy things easy. We can do all of these great things in it. But all of those things come with a set of risks that, frankly, again, that's where the difference comes, that maybe weren't present in your on-prem environment. You had all of these rigors, all of this change management, all of this incident management, all of these things that were, honed and tested, and your internal audit teams would come and take a look at all of that and say, yeah, you're doing great. And now you've introduced, again, a whole new set of tools, a whole new set of skill sets. You've got people who are managing and working in the cloud that weren't managing and working in your on-prem environment. You've got to set up those same rigors. You've got to set up those same capabilities. You've got to have those same checks and balances. Again, they might look different because we're trying to deploy faster and we're doing things in containers. You've got to adapt to that environment and measure those risks accordingly, but then be able to kind of, again, compile all of that and articulate that up to leadership in such a way that it can be absorbed. So you know where you need to make your investments. You need to know where you need to cancel out your biggest risks. And so it looks like it's an easier answer. It looks like it's this faster, better, quicker, thing. And to those that don't operate in it, it might look that way for, again, that non-technical manager or leader. But really, it just kind of almost sometimes duplicates, especially if you're kind of stuck in this hybrid world.
Do you mind if I jump in, which is like a little bit of
Please.
zest on that? This is such a near and dear topic to my heart because I'm going through audits at work right now. And we use Splunk. It is what it is. It's
Sure.
not a secret.
Nope. Yep.
And our data is stored in Azure, and we store it in Azure blobs. And we have internal auditors and leadership on our risk side who's like, well, what do you do when you run out of space? And I'm like, well, we don't run out of space. And they're like, well, we have a question here that says, what do you do when your disk gets full? I was like, oh, I guess, I don't know. And it's interesting. And so I don't have an answer to that, but just be aware as you get involved in these conversations, as Casey was saying, like the mental models change.
Yes.
I had a mentor, and I say had because it's a guy by the name of Steve Katz. Maybe some of you have heard of him or know him. He is known as the world's first CISO because he was the CISO at Citigroup in the 1990s, after they had a security issue. And he passed away, unfortunately, at the end of last year. And I had numerous conversations with him over the years, and he said, Frank, there are no security risks. There are only business risks. Right? And that's something I try to remind myself of because we, as security leaders, security experts, security practitioners, we've got to get into all of the detailed nitty-gritty about the differences between each of the cloud providers and all of the various tools and the tool chains that we're using. But then we've got to figure out, well, how do we tie that back to, well, what's the audit we need to achieve? If we don't achieve this compliance certification, we're going to lose some business. What's the new feature that we need to roll out? We move to the cloud, broadly speaking, because organizations are going through quote unquote digital transformation, right? Because they think they could do it better, faster, more effectively for their customers, right? So it's about tying the technical activities back to, yes, what are those business risks overall? Going to jump here to Eric on a totally different topic, going back to what we talked about before. And Thomas has a question related to responsible disclosure.
Sure.
Right. And we know as a security researcher, it can be frustrating. You spend all this time finding this issue, you report it, and the vendor seemingly says, so what? Right. And Thomas says, well, what responsibility do we as security practitioners have who discover cloud issues to make known the issues if the cloud provider shrugs their shoulders about it?
Yeah, I mean, if you've gone through the process and you've submitted something that you think is valuable and they look at it and they close it, I think at that point you're free to do that. And we've seen a lot of those cases where, some folks will give, here's the 90-day window. And I think Google's Project Zero, if you followed their research for a while, gave us some pretty good examples of, look, we're going to force your hand, not looking at somebody with even a formal bug bounty program, for example, to go get this fixed. And if you don't fix it, we're going to publish it. And, that stuff happens. It's part of it. I am not a huge bug bounty researcher. This is honestly what we're talking about is the first official one that I've ever received any sort of acknowledgement on. So I'm not an expert here, for the record. It just happens to be fairly fresh. Do you all have any other opinions on kind of how to handle that if they're just ignoring you?
I don't know if I should say this, but I say just disclose it. People aren't gonna, don't just do it like the day of, but I think if a vendor is not being responsive, you sort of have to make the assumption that someone else will discover this and someone else will exploit it, I think giving a reasonable amount of pressure, I love the 90 days, like, hey, you have 90 days to fix this, continue to push on it. And then I also try to have a sense of compassion for some of these companies because being on the other side, even having been adjacent to some mature bug bounty programs, there are so many submissions and a lot of them are bad and fake.
Right.
And it's just people, it's like, I found maybe cross-site scripting and, there's a lot of noise. And so I think that, think about it from the provider's point of view, but also set like a firm deadline and expectation to say like, hey, if you don't fix this, like I'm going to have to disclose it and then, your customers will get mad and then you'll have to fix it anyway. So just get out of it,
Yeah.
Switching topics here because we're getting a variety of different questions in Slack. Kim asks, I'm going to ask Casey, you to respond. For people coming into the industry, specifically to learn more about cloud, what would your advice be on where to start?
Training. Here we are, right? So I think about, I'll answer the question for someone that's new, that's coming in the industry. Find mentors. We talked about network. I can't stress that enough. I know that sounds like a very simple answer, but there are lots of people out there that have a lot of years of experience doing this. And there are people that are fresh, that are doing this, that are finding new and innovative ways to do this. Find groups to be a part of, find channels where you can join and have conversations, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Like I cannot stress enough, like in security, there are way too many topics, way too many functions, way too many capabilities. No one will know everything. And please don't be afraid of the question. Ask the question. All the security people I know are more than happy to give you a dissertation on any one topic that you want to know. But you've got to be willing to ask the questions. You've got to be willing to go to the trainings. You've got to be willing to kind of sit and listen and read and discern for yourself whether it's going to help you or not. But I think that this is true, not just for those that are new, but those that have been in the industry a long time, that frankly are, maybe you're at a company that is, going to a cloud provider or multiple cloud providers, if you're so lucky. Don't be afraid to learn those new things. Don't be afraid to ask those questions. Don't be afraid to take the time to do that. It's important. Literally everyone on my team has some level of responsibility with cloud capability. It doesn't matter if they're governance, risk, and compliance. It doesn't matter if they're training and awareness. It doesn't matter who they are. There are things to learn in this space, and you've got to be willing to ask the questions and frankly, take it upon yourself to be willing to do that.
Do you see any changes in companies having more opportunities for internships, apprenticeships? How do you get new people into your team in the past?
Yeah, there's not enough security people to do all the security things we need to do. I've said the thing, like, I think you can teach, like, you take someone who's maybe really good at development, maybe really good at program management, maybe really good at, whatever the topic might be, infrastructure, DevOps, whatever those things might be, and you can teach them the ways of security. I fundamentally believe that. But take the person's passion of whatever they have and teach them security if they're willing and if they're able. So we've pulled people from IT or various infrastructure, and we've made them security professionals. And I think that cross-functional capability of you got to find those people that are interested, but as soon as they are, latch onto that, because again, we have a shortage of people that need to take all of these security roles. And I think be willing. Don't assume that someone's going to have to be a computer science major to be able to do these things. I mean, we can train, we can have these capabilities, but we have to be willing to do that and have pathways and internships. The examples, boot camps. We do boot camps for high school students and even our existing employees that want to come and sit a part of boot camps. Be willing to be the trainer. Be willing to be the trainee. And create those environments where you're always educating. In brown bag sessions, the opportunities are endless.
Totally different question. And I know Eric knows all about this, so I'm going to ask Kevin. And Kevin knows about this too. We got a question from Vana. How do you normalize policies and configuration across multi-cloud?
That's a very good question. Pretend the cloud provider you don't like doesn't exist. That's what, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not saying we do that. GitHub right now, we're dealing with this. We have, a couple of different clouds. Obviously, we're moving to Azure as being a Microsoft subsidiary. But, we have some legacy cloud infrastructure. And what's actually interesting is, like, if you're a GitHub customer and you have our GitHub ES product, which is enterprise server, and you have a problem with it, our support team can go into GCP and clone your environment, essentially spin it up and see if we can figure out the bugs. And, we do put that under a vulnerability management program. There's some interesting risk acceptance we have to do with that. But what we do is heavily rely on Wiz. I've been a big fan of Wiz as a CSPM. It's the only way we've really been able to get our hands around the technical aspect of this. And then we sort of normalize our controls over CIS, and then we do some internal research as well that's like only relevant to GitHub in the way that we deploy stuff. So just great visibility. CSPM is where I would start. I don't know any good open source free ones, like Scout is one. Yeah.
Tony's here somewhere, probably. Prowler, I would.
Yeah.
He'd beat me up if I didn't mention it.
So yeah. And then just use industry best practices, right? Like fun fact about Cosmos DB, if you just click admin and like launch one, it's publicly exposed to the internet. Pretty cool. learn about your technology. Say, hey, if
Yeah.
you're running a document DB type database, whether it's Dynamo, Cosmos, whatever, shut off public access.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where I'd land with the shift right approach. And
Yeah.
if you get that down, look at shifting left with like IAC tools like Terraform, and then start looking at policy guardrails in your CI pipelines to try to detect those things earlier so it doesn't end up in Wiz eventually anyway. And that's how you've kind of tackled it from both sides. And you mentioned DevOps earlier. That's kind of all going to glue together to
Yes.
become part of that continuous cycle that you're looking for.
Absolutely.
Totally different topic here. We've got a number of other questions that have come in. Al has a question, and Al, I'm going to maybe slightly reinterpret this. I think what you're saying is it's a supply chain related question, Casey. And so you've got, of course, hey, cloud means a rabbit hole of third parties. Well, and we know this, it's a whole supply chain ecosystem. You've not only got the third party risk, but the fourth party risk. What about the third parties that your third parties are relying upon? How do you get visibility into that? And the question is, hey, well, what can the security team members, those of us in the technical trenches, do to handle these different rabbit holes?
Yeah, third-party risk management plus, like, I cannot, third-party risk management is vital to any organization, and to have the right skill sets and ask, this cannot be, it has to be a standard questionnaire. It has to be a standard, way in which we ask these questions. But again, I go back to kind of baking this intelligence into and training your team members. The questions that you would need to ask a SaaS provider or to your point, a fourth party risk are different than what we would potentially, traditionally ask. You have to have some of those skill sets. You also, I'll just throw AI into this as well, because that's a fun topic too. Knowing which of these cloud providers are doing different capabilities for you, whether that be for the business or whether it's for you as a security team or whether it's for your infrastructure team, whatever those cases are. Know what that data is that they're managing, know what the intentions are, but have a capability of managing that over time, because we always see these SaaS providers kind of, the relationships change, the capabilities change. They want to throw more capabilities at those, at those products, and then, take more of your data and be able to handle that or manage that for you. Always have a way to constantly go back and re-look at those relationships, re-look at the risks of those vendors, and to the point of fourth party risk, kind of go downstream of who's providing their capabilities and who's providing their functions. And that's true, again, from both a kind of a tooling and capability perspective, but it's also true if you're using somebody to, I don't know, process payments or anything else, like, again, those downstream providers, and absorbing that risk. But I go back to, don't assume once that you've reviewed that vendor and reviewed that relationship and reviewed that set of data, and that's going to be the end of it. This is an ever-changing world. I mean, businesses like to change those relationships on a frequent basis. You've got to go back to the drawing board and continuously re-review those relationships and rank those risks and communicate those risks and keep track of those risks.
Great. All right. Another question here. And Raju asked this question, and I'm going to go ahead and answer it myself. Apologies to the panel here. And yes, many technical individuals are unfamiliar with business language and business values. What importance would you give on understanding business language and improving versus improving technical knowledge? Now, I think we kind of gave a hint of this, and like I think all of us, we started our careers in some sort of technical role. And back then, when I was hands-on keyboard, typing away at my cubicle all day long, happy as can be, I never thought I would take a management job. Why? Do you know why? I thought those managers didn't do anything, right? Incorrectly. I incorrectly thought that, right? And over time, I just naturally took on more leadership responsibilities, team lead responsibilities that grew into different management roles and leadership roles, and then eventually different CISO roles and so on. And, as a technical person, in reflection, right, I couldn't have been more incorrect, right? Hey, the leaders, managers have to deal with a lot of stuff, ideally moving out roadblocks. So, Raju, to your question, and apologies here in the limited time that we have, sorry for the shameless plug. In addition to cloud, I lead the leadership curriculum at SANS. So, Raju, if you just Google SANS leadership triads, that will give you a starting point to answer a number of those questions. Bottom line is, very important, right? If you want to stand out even as a technical person, hey, you need to understand how this ties back to various business things. I worked at companies where, to be honest, I had no idea what the companies did from a business perspective, because I was just doing my day-to-day work in my cubicle, right? So, but it depends what your goal is, right? But yes, if you want to improve, yeah, got to be, round out those business and technical skills. All right, we're getting towards the end of the time here. Now, all of us were new in our careers at one point in time. This is kind of related to stuff we talked about before, starting with Erica to come all the way on down. What advice do you have for someone fresh out of college with a cybersecurity degree and no other IT or development experience trying to start their career?
That's a great question. And I think, we've all touched on it at one point or another, but security and cybersecurity is kind of it's a cross-cutting responsibility for every single job role in IT, whether it's management, infrastructure, ops, dev, et cetera. So holistically, I don't view cybersecurity as an individual siloed discipline. So pick something, Kevin mentioned networking, we've mentioned dev, we've mentioned product, we've mentioned cloud. Pick a thing, whatever seems the most interesting to you. Go do some cross training with that network team, if that's the case, or the firewall team, and learn how to do that inside and out. And as you do it, you're going to find some touch points where you think to yourself, you know what, that's a really important security piece to whatever that puzzle is that you're putting together. And now you've done something very valuable with cybersecurity. You've infused that into a different part of the org that needs it, and then just keep going, find new problems to solve.
Yeah. So I talked about this a little bit early in my career. I never, ever, ever would have guessed when I was sitting there writing Java and JavaScript that I'd be, sitting here talking about, security practices and how those get orchestrated across an entire department. But I would just kind of plus one that to say, when I mentor other people, when I have these conversations, I think they always want to know, like, what certification should I get, or what, what sort of track should I go down? I don't think there's any one path, and I don't know that, I think training is important. I think curiosity. I mean, you talked about that, right?
Right.
Find the thing that's passionate for you. Follow your curiosity, and I mean that in a fundamental way. Follow what you're curious in, what drives you, what is passionate for you, and then if that leads more into security, then we're happy about it. But I would say, again, I've done almost every hat there is across security, but it's not because I stood up one day and said I'm going to try everything. It's literally I tried one thing, I got curious about the next thing that came from that, and I kept going. And I think it's important to, again, we talked about it, ask questions, create a network, find a mentor, but get your hands dirty and be curious in the one thing that you're going to do, because then it'll lead to the next thing, and before you know it, you've got a career in it.
I'll go like pretty practical. I would say, as Casey mentioned, join your local hacker group, whatever that is.
Yeah.
I started DC 480 back in Arizona. I think you got 303 out here, right? 303 is pretty legendary. Been to a few of y'all's parties, appreciate it. 801 if you're in Salt Lake City, right? Look up your local DEF CON group, or 2600, or OWASP, or whatever, right? Get out there, start meeting people. Also, whatever your local regional conference is, go to that too, because there's going to be vendors there looking to hire people, right? Talk to the managers there. My little pro tip is you find speakers, and then you wait for them to get off stage, and then you bombard them with questions, because you don't get on stage to talk about something because you don't like talking, right? For finding a mentor, I really love mentorship and being on sort of both sides of that equation. And people are like, well, how do I find a mentor? I have this tremendous lady, Grace Kim, who lives in Phoenix, and she came to a DC 480 meeting, and she was writing academic proposal for grants for the state of Arizona, and she didn't like doing it. She wanted to get to InfoSec. And the way she found a mentor is she walked up to me and said, hey, will you be my mentor? And I said, yeah, let's go to lunch. Let's talk about it. So we went to lunch. I gave her some homework. She did the homework. And then within 18 months, she was a security engineer for a hospitality company, right? It was really amazing. So don't be afraid to ask. You're going to get no. And sometimes, I'll tell you this story. I was really excited to have a mentor when I was working at PayPal. Very nice guy, great security leader. And I found out this guy had a master's degree in philosophy, and I'm a philosophy nerd. And so I was like, heck yeah, I want to sit down and talk to this person about what is the existential meaning? What is the good faith of being a manager? And yeah, he's like, oh yeah, I haven't really looked at any of that since I was in college. And I was so disappointed. And I sort of cut off that relationship. Again, great guy, still was wonderful to work with. I just realized oh, this is not what I'm looking for. I know what I'm looking for in this relationship. So yeah.
Great examples. Now, with about 5 minutes left, it brings us to the challenge portion of our panel. Now, in terms of the question, I'm going to ask each of you to ask the panelist one other question, right? Just one, not two. So we'll start with Eric. Eric, what is one question you have for one of your other panelists?
I've got one for both because I'm very interested in how both of your orgs manage this. And I think a lot of our audience is enterprise focused, and I'm assuming, and maybe I'm incorrect, but I think a fair amount of the audience is in a organization that is fairly siloed with separate dev, separate compliance, separate security teams. And a lot of the questions I get from individuals are based on what does this look like in this new world where everybody's kind of building and running their products from end to end? And should that team own compliance, or should we still have separate compliance that's asking the question about running out of storage in an infinite storage account?
Yeah.
Things like that. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on what does the modern org structure look like, and who owns security and risk and governance in that scenario?
Yeah. So in security, we always preach, right? We want security to feel like changing the oil in your car, right? We want security culture so embedded in the organization that it still has to feel like a separate function. So to answer your question, it still needs to look like this separate org and this separate function that is deeply skilled in those capabilities, in those those functions. And you mentioned SOC, like people that are literally watching over the whole thing and
Yep.
and managing those external threats as they come. So those components will always be there, but security culture and baking not only compliance but just mindset and thought and theory and architecture into the product build is critical. In that's the only way we're scalable, frankly, is to be able to, again, educate, train, not just your security professionals. If you've got a 5, 10, 50, 100,000 person team, whatever the size of the security organization is, that training is important. But it's also your infrastructure team members and your peers in legal and privacy, and doesn't matter where they are in the organization. Kind of baking that security culture into the other parts of the organization kind of makes it part of the undercurrent of what you're doing. And I think that that's the only way we're scalable. So yes, to the kind of what I would consider the traditional formalized structure of needing to have those traditional security capabilities and functions and continuing to invest in that, but then also sharing that security culture out with the rest of the organization and finding new ways and fun ways to do that.
I love it.
Yeah, I think continuing on with that, finding fun ways to like communicate security. One of the things that our ProdSec team does at work is they do a CTF. And so it's like, oh, hey,
Yes.
developers will get to do a CTF in October, Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is great. Something I'm a big fan of is being easy to get a hold of, right? When you get an issue from my team, there's a link. Here's our Slack channel. Here's our repo. Come talk to us, right? Like, and I've worked at organizations where security teams, there was like there's like a phone number you had to call. It was written in Sanskrit and you had to like read it backwards. And it's like, no, be easy to find. I think the compliance piece is something I have very radical and strong views about, that this comes down to management incentives. I would say, when you're looking at, and this is probably not something frontline people or frontline EMs like myself really have to deal with, but think about the incentives of your leadership, right? Is someone going to get paid for being secure, or are they going to get paid for shipping features? And try not to make that the same person, right? Try to separate that out a bit. I really like security reporting up to chief risk officers personally, right? That's my fintech background coming through though, so.
This brings us to the double challenge portion here because we are very short on time. So Kevin, you might not get to your question, but Casey, what is one question you have for somebody else?
I would say the question becomes like, if you have a security professional on a team or in a group that is traditionally part of that on-prem or even now hybrid environment, what is one direction that you would tell them to go to be able to kind of broaden that landscape for them and be able to do my current job, but be able to do it in a broader space in the cloud, or even in multiple cloud environments or cloud providers?
It would depend on the cloud, and I know this might be a bit of a spicy suggestion, but I recommend that people just get the basic associate level cert in whatever cloud you're interested in. So
Yeah.
if you want to go, learn Azure, go get the AZ900. It's going to introduce you to a lot of stuff, and then you can start interrogating security questions, through that material.
Yeah, I'd start with just the basic trainings wherever you pick it up from. There's lots of little cloud nuggets out there, little events you can go to. Frank and I have been putting a workshop cloud security program together in our curriculum for the whole year. Like there's a workshop every single month doing a different thing inside of one of the providers. Just get your hands dirty, start practicing, fail, bang your head against the wall until you finally break it down and move on to the next thing.
And they're all online and free, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. The Aviata workshop, right? It's at sans.org/ACE135, I think.
With that note, we are out of time. Thank you so much, panel. Thank you so much, everybody in the audience, for your questions.